do you see in this document a real paranoia about China, a real concern across, it's not just one or two issues, it's across a whole broad front of what this means for Russia. And I think the subtext is a real recognition that Russia is the junior partner here, that they've got an awful lot to lose in the face of what seems to be quite an enormous espionage operation.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Ian Williams, longtime foreign correspondent who's reported from Russia, China and Ukraine and is author of the book Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian, welcome.
Good to be back.
Well, to start, Ian, I want to discuss this report that the New York Times has put out. They've got a hold of a Russian FSB document which seems to basically call China the enemy. What does that tell us about the relationship between these two states that are supposed to be in an alliance?
Well, it's supposed to be a no-limits partnership, according to Putin and Xi Jinping, but this does show the depth of mistrust, the fact that you scratch the surface and they are enormously suspicious of each other. Now, this document, it's an FSB document dated, we think, from perhaps last year, perhaps 2023, but certainly pretty recent. And the New York Times were concerned at first that, well, maybe it's a forgery, maybe it's a fake, but they put it past their intelligence sources, several, half a dozen of them, who did vouch for its authenticity. And yes, here we have the Russians implying that, China is an enemy, that what they describe a tense and dynamically developing intelligence battle, which would seem that they're devoting an awful lot of resource at trying to keep Chinese spies at bay, who seem to be as busy in Russia as we've seen them here in London and elsewhere in the West.
And, is this an issue with their alliance, or is this in a way just the nature of not only Russia and China, but authoritarian states in general? They are very suspicious of others.
I think it's the nature of espionage. I think everybody spies on everybody else. I think we see that even within close Western alliances. There are people keeping an eye on each other. But I think the extraordinary thing with these revelations is Russia at the moment is so utterly dependent upon China, both in terms of underwriting its war in Ukraine, underwriting its economy, purchasing raw materials, purchasing all manner of stuff from Russia to keep the economy afloat, supplying Russia with dual technology, with other things which can be used to keep the Russian military industrial complex ticking over. So the partnership, so called, is very, very heavily weighted in China's favor at the moment, which I think Russia probably realizes and feels rather uncomfortable with. And of course, historically, there's an awful lot of suspicion between the two. And there are a number of emerging areas, whether it's private mercenary forces, China looking to try and learn from the Wagner group, whether it's the Arctic opening up and the potential for exploitation there, where the interests of the two don't necessarily combine, and where clearly China is looking to learn as much as it can from Russia.
And I mean, I'm keen to get into some of that history in, because, at the heart of this all, there's that question really is, are Russia and China natural allies or not? Obviously, during the Cold War, they became pretty strong rivals. So why have they now come back together?
No, in fact, you could argue that it's a very surprising relationship. It's driven by a common adversary, a common view of the world, if you like, between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. They both have enormous resentments. They both dream of restoring imperial power. The Russians talk about the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. They don't accept that Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent state. They regard it as part of the Russian world. China, Xi Jinping has his China dream of restoring China's greatness, starting with snatching Taiwan. But also you have nationalists close to Xi who dream of restoring China to its Qing dynasty borders, which were considerably more expansive than they are at the moment. And of course, those borders would include large chunks of what is modern day Russia. We forget because China bangs on a lot about a century of humiliation, about rapacious Western countries nibbling away at China, unequal treaties, Hong Kong being a prime example, usually wheeled out. But we forget that during the 19th century, several treaties between Russia and China meant that Russia was by far the most rapacious country in terms of the amount of territory it took from China. Vast swathes of China north of the Amur River, also in the Far East, also modern day Vladivostok. 10% of China was taken by the Russians. And so if you're going to talk about unequal treaties and voracious foreigners, though, Russia's right up there at the top. And Chinese nationalists haven't forgotten that. Chinese textbooks still show the old borders of the Qing dynasty. Only a year or two back, it was decreed by the Communist Party that all maps produced in China should show the Chinese name of these Russian cities as well as the Russian name. So Vladivostok becomes Hai Shenwai, Sea Cucumber Bay, because that was the Chinese name before it was taken by the Russians. And, in Moscow, they will be reading this stuff. And Xi Jinping is primarily, first and foremost, a nationalist and quite a rabid nationalist. So's Putin. And so we talk about their shared vision of the world, their shared desire to see a new world order, to see the dismantling of what they see as the American-led order. But certainly when you look at what comes next, there's a lot of contradictions. They both have imperialist visions, and those imperialist visions do clash. And I think now and again, documents like this come as a welcome reminder of just how deep those historic animosities are.
And so, in the modern day, does China still hold those territorial claims over Russia seriously? I mean, will there be fears in the Kremlin that China could one day try to retake that land, one day soon even?
I think very deep concerns. Technically, they've been solved. There have been treaties to say that the borders as they exist at the moment are permanent. But China hasn't got a very good record at recognizing this. We look at the historic claims which have been made in the South China Sea, claims in the Himalayas against India, nibbling away at Bhutan. Things which we thought were settled become rapidly unsettled. And China's claims are very vague, drawing on vague historic claims that have no real weight under international law. And it's no stretch of the imagination to see that a very weakened Russia, and Russia is aware that all its resources are going into Ukraine, espionage, military, that it's very vulnerable. And I think there are those in China who would clearly like to take back some of those lands which they would see it as being unfairly wrenched from the control of the Qing dynasty. And don't forget as well that during we concentrate on the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West, but there was another Cold War which unfolded over 3 decades between between communist China and the Soviet Union. That led to quite serious clashes on the shared border. At one point, Russia was hinting that it would use nuclear weapons against China. It was, relationships were effectively frozen for almost 3 decades, only thawing around the late 90s when Gorbachev was in power and Deng Xiaoping, who wanted to solve some of these issues so he could concentrate on economic development. But I think also what's often not appreciated so much is after the collapse of the Soviet Union, China sent enormous amounts of the espionage and the recruitment that went on. It was chaotic. I was in Russia in the early years of the 90s when the whole place was chaotic. Everything had a price. Corruption was rife. The economy was criminalized. And collapsing. And China was extremely active then in recruiting scientists, in buying technology, in espionage more generally, in picking over the entrails of the collapsed Soviet Union. So there is a record there. It was very opportunistic. At that time, the Russian military, the Russian arms industry was much bigger and more advanced than that of China. So it was very keen to learn and to plunder and to steal and to recruit. So there is history there, and that's quite recent history. And I think if you look at the documents that the New York Times has, one of the things that Russia seems to be after is looking at the way weapons have performed, the sort of strategies that the Russians have been using in Ukraine. And there's a new term in espionage now where you can piggyback on the back of other foreign intelligence agencies. So, for instance, if they can penetrate the FSB or penetrate Russian espionage circles, they can piggyback on what they're discovering about the West or about Ukraine, because Russia still has quite effective espionage services. So, and then of course it's a competition in the Arctic as we see global warming meaning more accessibility. Both Russia and China have big ambitions for the Arctic, and you see in this document a real paranoia about China, a real concern across. It's not just one or two issues; it's across a whole broad front of what this means for Russia. And I think the subtext is a real recognition that Russia is the junior partner here, that they've got an awful lot to lose in the face of what seems to be quite an enormous espionage operation. I mean, we know from our experience here in the UK and elsewhere in the West the sheer scale of China's espionage and influence operations. It's been likened to 1,000 grains of sand. There's been other analogies. I mean, it's very, very big. And I think that Russia is also a focus of this.
And yet, we still see President Xi at Victory Day reaffirming the alliance with Russia. Especially since the invasion of Ukraine, they really seem to have deepened their economic ties as well. How deep does that go, and why do you think there is such an effort to appear as allies, even when maybe they don't seem to really believe that?
I think it's a marriage of convenience. They share a deep suspicion of the West. As I say, they share a, a, a view of the world as one that should be divided into spheres of influence, big power politics with no room for pesky little ambitions of countries like Ukraine or Taiwan. And at the moment, it serves both their purposes to appear to be united in the face of the West. I think that it is skin deep. I think that part of the Xi's aim in going to Moscow, he's tried to embrace the idea of China being part of the victory over fascism. That doesn't really bear scrutiny because it was not the Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese nationalists who they were fighting at the time, who did most of the fighting against Japan. Mao Zedong pretty much sat on the sidelines and let them slug it out. Figuring quite rightly that at the end of the war he'd be able to more easily defeat a much weakened nationalist government in China. So I see it as being very much in their interests at the moment to give the impression of being very close, to be to give the impressions of a no limits partnership. But I think the value of a document like this being leaked, and of course the mechanism and the mechanics by which it was leaked, we don't know too much about. But that in itself is quite fascinating. But it does rip away this facade and remind us of just how little trust there is beneath the surface.
And as you say, there are these limits to their relationships. I mean, the head of Kiev's foreign intelligence service has accused China recently of providing Russian arms factories with materiel. Earlier this year, we did see these Chinese men captured fighting in the Russian army, but there's no evidence that they were actually sent by China or that China even really knew they were there. It is notable, isn't it, that the level of limits there are to the military alliance between these two nations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of a red line there, which everybody's looking very closely at to see if and when China crosses it. And they've certainly probed it. They've certainly put their toes right up against it, particularly in dual use technology, in the supply of drones, for instance, in the supply of machine tools, in the supply of other technology chips to keep Russia ticking over. And all of that has pretty clear military applications. Yes, the Chinese soldiers that were taken by Ukraine appear to be mercenaries, but China exercises a pretty tight control over the actions of its nationals. And I think that China is very curious to see how Russian policy and tactics are unfolding in Ukraine. And one of the interesting things that came out of this document are suggestions by the FSB that they should pump up and exaggerate the successes, in Ukraine, that they're aware that Chinese spies are there trying to get details on the success or otherwise of various weapons systems, various strategies. Because don't forget, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has quite a lot in common with the Russian military in the way it's organized. So they're keen to try and learn from Russia's tactics and mistakes in Ukraine for a possible war in Taiwan. But there's an intriguing part of the document where they discuss how to feed misinformation back to Chinese spies in order to build up the success of the operation in Ukraine, in order to exaggerate their successes and the way that the campaign is going, in order to keep China on board. And underlying this is a sort of neuroses that perhaps China's support is not as strong as it could be, and that they don't want to lose this support from China, this diplomatic cover, this economic lifeline, and they're aware of the espionage and want to feed into it a positive narrative to keep the Chinese on board.
And on the world stage, Ian, both of these nations are part of these kind of two sets of partnerships that have emerged. BRICS initially, this sort of loose economic partnership, and then CRINCS, which is more something that that has been not invented but recognized in the West. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Who's the kind of senior partner, do you think, or the driving force in those alliances between Russia and China?
I think it's China without a doubt, but I think they are all riven by suspicion, because you have, it sounds, I know, a bit of a cliche, but you have Western alliances. I was listening to Mark Rutte yesterday at the Chatham House, the NATO Secretary General, talking about NATO's plans. And it's sometimes a bit of a cliche, but the Western defense alliances are driven by shared values. They're driven by a positive desire for people to be there in order to defend something which they believe in. And I think the problem with alliances of autocrats, they are by definition much more paranoid. They don't share those the sort of values which you can see in a Western alliance. And I think that if you look, for instance, at some of the military operations, the military drills, which are becoming increasingly common, between China and Russia. Iran has taken part in these as well. They're very showy. They happen now quite regularly in different parts of the world, from South China Sea to the Middle East. But they still differ markedly from when you see NATO exercising, or even exercising between the US and Japan and South Korea, when there is clear interoperability, by which I mean that there are shared systems within the military. There's no meaningful shared interoperability between Chinese armed forces and Russia, which in itself suggests a degree of suspicion, and if it came to actual conflict, a possible inability to really work side by side because the systems are so incompatible, and there's been no real attempt to unify those systems in a way which means they could meaningfully and operationally work together. One of those aspects in cyber, for instance, where you need an enormous amount of trust, which the Five Eyes Western Alliance has been working together for decades on this, but there's simply no trust, and we're seeing this. I think that's perhaps the most important thing to come through in this document, that in spite of all the words of unity, the no limits rhetoric, the idea that their time has come, the amount of trust is just not there. And you scratch the surface, and you see the paranoia of two autocrats towards what they claim are their closest allies.
And you talked about the Western alliance in comparison there, NATO, the main one. Is there a wider recognition of the threat of a China-Russia alliance in the West and in Europe, do you think, at the moment?
I think there is. I don't think it's spoken about as loudly as it should be, but I think there clearly is. Rutte yesterday in London was very much talking about the China threat and the China long-term threat, and also the autocratic alliance with Russia and with Iran. So I think it is appreciated, but I think there's more sensitivity about calling China out than there is about calling Russia out, which still surprises me, because it should happen, and you're not really doing yourself any favor by not calling China out. But I think the nature of this alliance is becoming increasingly clear to Western alliances, and we've seen recently attempts by China to try and prize the European Union away from the US. Look, let's all be unified against this Trump wrecking ball in Washington. But I think that apart from some countries, Slovakia, Hungary, I think the wariness towards Beijing is running very, very deep now in Europe. And that's really a product of Beijing's own behavior, both in terms of its own rule breaking, whereby countries in Europe can see the hypocrisy of calling out Trump, but also because of the alliance with Russia and because of Ukraine, because I think countries recognize that Russia's behavior, Russia's war in Ukraine, its violence in Ukraine, would not be possible without Chinese support. China is underwriting the war in Ukraine, and I think this is widely seen across Europe. And I don't think relationships could ever go back to anything that we saw just a few years ago, while that is still the case.
Well, Ian Williams, thank you very much for joining me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.